Wollondilly Shire Council Senior Staff Behaviour Part 2. Let's have a look at the following staff members' behaviour and see whether or not it's systemic within this organisation. Tony Spence, who's the Principal Governance Officer, Joanna Kratz, who's a GIS Team Leader, and Lynette Coford, who's a Senior Policy Advisor. Tony Spence. Now, this position is to provide information to the public about council functions pursuant to the legislation. Now, you would think that as she is the principal officer, her knowledge would be extensive, so let's have a look. According to the PIPA Act, performance records are not deemed as personal information and can be released. A GIPA application was submitted requesting this, and Tony Spence stated in 2 different emails that the reason it wouldn't be released is because of it being personal and private information. This is not supported by any legislation. Perhaps it's misleading and deceitful. It was further confirmed in a face-to-face conversation between the applicant and herself, in which the applicant came in to pay for the information and was told that the performance records wouldn't be released due to privacy. But what did the actual notice of decision say? Well, let's remember, in 2 different emails and 1 face-to-face conversation, it was stated that the information wouldn't be released due to privacy. However, the notice said it wasn't released due to non-payment, but the applicant tried to pay repeatedly and was refused. The notice of decision was handed to the applicant after close of business so that payment couldn't be made by none other than Joanna Kratz, a GIS team leader, and has nothing to do with the governance department. So we have a governance officer who is saying one thing in an email correspondence and in a face-to-face meeting, but then saying something else in other correspondence. Doesn't that fall into corruption and fraud? I'm unsure, but it appears this employee deals with quite a few government agencies, and maybe this is something she does frequently, which should be quite concerning and potentially investigated. Joanna Kratz was employed as a GIS team leader. However, documentation states she was acting governance manager, whilst her position was GIS team leader. But in order for a team leader to be moved up to a manager's position temporarily, the position must be advertised pursuant to the Local Government Act. This wasn't done according to council documents. Council documents clearly state that the position for the acting governance manager was never advertised, and so therefore the appointment could not have occurred. The representation by Joanna Kratz of the position of acting governance manager is clearly misleading and deceitful, and would more than likely fall within the deception and fraud categories of the corruption and fraud prevention policy. It could also possibly be corruption by public official. Now, an application was made to view the disclosure logs in which Joanna Kratz and Paul Mangione, surprise, surprise, were standing over the residents. They were asked to leave repeatedly. They refused. However, council documents state that they were harassing the members of the public by failing to adhere to the code of conduct, which clearly states staff are not to harass or intimidate any member of the public. They acknowledged that they were asked to leave repeatedly and refused. You will notice the pattern of behaviour forming with some of these staff, not to mention the blatant disregard to adhere to the Local Government Act, code of conduct or council policy. Lynette Coford, Senior Policy Advisor, or perhaps access to information, it depends on the day. Now, Lynette Coford is Wollondilly Shire Council's Senior Policy Advisor or Access to Information Officer, depending on which piece of correspondence you refer to. This staff member tried passing herself off as 2 different positions when dealing with a formal GIPA application. It was only after her position was found and she was confronted with it, she decided to sign the correspondence with her full position. Now, a meeting was organised between herself and an applicant to discuss a GIPA application, and Joanna Kratz, who was employed as Council's GIS team leader, wanted to attend. The applicant refused to enter into a room with Joanna Kratz, who is not part of the governance team, as legislation was not followed correctly regarding the appointment of that position. Remember, Lynette Coford is the Senior Policy Advisor, so why was Joanna Kratz trying to pass herself off as the acting governance manager when the correct procedure had not been followed pursuant to the Local Government Act? So therefore, the appointment could not have occurred. So you have 2 staff members trying to insist that a resident is only allowed a meeting if 2 of them are present. This was never agreed to nor necessary, and if we look at Joanna Kratz's behaviour, this seems to be a pattern. She stood over 2 residents after being repeatedly asked to leave whilst residents accessed information that is to be made available. She did that with Paul Mangione, and in this incident tried to do it again. It certainly looks like Joanna Kratz is struggling to follow policy. What to do? It should be noted that the staff don't always wear their identification. Now, it is a requirement and they are provided with it. So my recommendation for dealing with any of these staff thus far is to always have someone with you. Never enter into a private room with more than 1 staff member, and always get the documented copy of who was in attendance at the time. This is something you should always request. You are not required to engage with any staff member who is not wearing identification, nor do you need to be in a room with more than 1 person, no matter what they say. These staff are in senior positions, and come September 10, when the community decides who the councillors will be, those new councillors can look at all of this information and determine whether these staff are acting firstly in line with the legislation, which is mandatory, and which, if they are not, they can be removed. Secondly, is it good customer service to harass members of the public when they are trying to access services that are available to them? This is stuff that they actually are paying for. They can have it. It's time to vote consciously. East Ward candidate Kelly Ferguson will ensure that staff adhere to legislation, or they can work somewhere else. Members of the public have a right to be treated in a way that is in line with the legislation and policy, and if staff aren't willing to adhere to that, then they need to be removed. These are senior staff, which is what makes this so concerning. Managers, team leaders are treating people like this, and these are the people who are supposed to be setting the example. This should not be acceptable. And what have your current councillors done about this? Oh, that's right. On the 15th of August, they voted to give senior staff a pay rise. It's time for a change. This should not be acceptable, and it certainly shouldn't be rewarded with a pay rise. Make your vote count. Put in people who will put an end to this. East Ward candidate Kelly Ferguson, vote 1.